In the last lecture, we talked a little bit about whether or not you wanted to include counter-arguments in your speech. So let's say that, yes, you do. You want to include counter-arguments in your speech. So now what I want to spend our time talking about is, what do you respond to? You don't necessarily have to respond to everything. You want to sort of pick and choose your battles. What do you need to respond to in order to achieve your goals? So in order to do this, we have to figure out where you and your audience disagree. And in argumentation, we call these clash points, where you and your audience disagree. Everything in argumentation is so violent, but we're talking about clash points. And this is akin to the classical notion of stasis theory, sort of seeing the stances in a debate, stasis as stances, positions. And the classical rhetorician Deborah Hawley has pointed out how in rhetoric, understanding stases was also very similar to how sort of young wrestlers would learn how to wrestle. So if you can look at your opponent and see what stance that they've taken, well, you're going to design your attack or your response accordingly. You're not going to try to sweep the leg if they don't have any weight on their leg. So you want to see what their position is so that you can strategize an appropriate position. That's what stasis theory allows you to do, is identify these clash points and figure out which one of these clash points you really need to respond to if you're going to be persuasive. So in doing this, in this lecture here, we're going to talk about distinguishing between matters of fact, policy, and value to help us identify these clash points. So to begin with, fact. Debates over fact, assertions of fact, are really issues of what is or what isn't, what happened or what didn't. These can be non-controversial. So today is Thursday. That's not a particularly controversial claim. It's something I would like you to take as valid, but we can adjudicate this easily. I can have multiple people come in and say, yes, it is indeed Thursday. So you're not watching. Who knows if you're watching it on a Thursday? Nevertheless, that's a pretty low threshold claim. But other claims of fact can be far more complicated. So certainly in criminal cases, many times, they're trying to decide on matters of fact. Did person X steal this car or not steal this car? It either happened or it didn't happen. You do this at work, right? How many people will use our new service? Well, we don't know, but we can make estimates. How many people use the old service? What were the customer service ratings on the old service? These are all things that can probably be sorted out. You can go look up that information. Scientists all the time argue over issues of fact. So was there such a thing that we called for a while the Brontosaurus? So they thought so for a long time, that there was this thing called the Brontosaurus, but prevailing interpretation of fact now is that no, it was an Apatosaurus with a couple of other fossils mixed in. So these are matters of fact, okay, where what is or what isn't. Then we can shift to matters of policy. And in discussions of policy, we're trying to adjudicate questions about what we as a collective should do. And in many cases, these are harder to decide, or at least different to decide, because we're dealing with the contingencies of the future. Okay? So here in the U.S., one of the debates about policy that we've had for a long time, hugely controversial, is what should the U.S. do about health care costs, about health care coverage. Okay, this is a question about what should our policy be? What should the laws be that bind us as a collective, as U.S. citizens together? Here in the state of Washington, we had a policy debate around what should we do about same-sex marriage. Okay? So these are policies that affect us in the state of Washington. But you have these outside of these sort of large issues. If your company is thinking about opening a new branch office, well, where should we put that branch office? Well, that's a serious consideration because it's a significant allocation of resources. But you're trying to make decisions that will affect what you do in the future. You know, how should your organization raise awareness? You have to pick among campaigns. You're making a decision about what's going to happen in the future. So we've got fact, we've got policy, and we turn finally to value. Debates about value, questions of value, are asking what is good or bad. Okay, what is appropriate or inappropriate. And these can be difficult to adjudicate because often they're dealing with personal or collective belief. So one of the big ones, right, is abortion moral or immoral? That's a huge question, but it's a value question. We can shift it into an aesthetic realm, an aesthetic realm. Is Star Trek better than Star Wars? Well, you can have lots of debates over that, but we're talking in the realm of value. So fact, policy, and value. But of course, rarely is a single topic restricted to just one of those categories. Usually it's a mixture of all three. So we can turn to the idea of the debate around how old is the Earth? Well, scientists say 4.5 billion years. Young Earth creationists would say something more like 6,000 years. This is primarily a debate over fact, but certainly value is coming in there. Okay? Young Earth creationists are not necessarily coming to that independent of their values or their beliefs. Now, that same question, the combination changes if the Earth's age comes up in a discussion of public school textbooks. So if the question was, should public school textbooks date the Earth at 4.5 billion years? Well, that's primarily a policy question, but it is deeply interwoven with those fact and value issues. Okay? And to the degree that people would argue over it, they're coming at it from various angles. Any one question might be more policy-oriented, fact-oriented, value-oriented, but overall that debate is covering a lot of different territories. So let's take a look at another example. So here in the US, there are debates over government fuel standards. Well, that's a matter of policy, that's a matter of law. But these debates are very much linked to fact debates about the role of emissions in global climate change. And certainly with evaluative frameworks over environmentalism or industrialism. So you can't really pull that debate out of all three, but rather have to understand how individual points are circulating among those three different realms. The same thing affects much smaller issues. Here in the city of Seattle, there's always a debate about whether or not we should build more bike lanes. Okay, so that's fact, policy, and value. And we deal with these questions all the time. Where should we go out for dinner is, in essence, a question that can be adjudicated through debate. And of course, this one is perhaps the most intractable of all. But it's a question about the future. Where should we go? That's policy. But what are you in the mood for? Well, I don't know. Fact. How good is that restaurant? Well, I heard it was quite good. Well, I heard it was quite bad. They had a health code violation. Debate over fact. No, they didn't. That's ridiculous. So these very small questions can also be understood through the lenses of fact, policy, and value. And what thinking through a debate with these lenses gets you is it helps you map the debate more closely. It helps you figure out where you and your audience disagree. It helps you find these clash points. And finding those clash points is hugely important if you're going to persuade that audience. So you can answer questions like, what values are they using, or what aren't they talking about? That's a great opportunity to get an easy win. If they're not talking about something and it's important to the debate, maybe you can bring it up and be persuasive by doing so. What audience beliefs can you leave in place? Because remember, you're trying to figure out how to be persuasive, but you don't have to argue everything. So how can you maybe contain your argument so it's not bigger or more controversial than you need? So what I want you to do is just think through a topic that you're working on. And again, this can be the persuasive speech that you might do for this class, or a speech that you have to give at work or at a civic organization, or the next speech you have to give. But think through that topic in terms of fact, policy, and value. If you have to persuade an audience and there's disagreement, where is that disagreement? What is the nature of that disagreement? And in the next lecture, we'll sort through some strategies for addressing these clash points in a persuasive manner. But before we figure out how to respond to these clash points, we got to begin by figuring out what these clash points actually are. That's what this lecture was about, and I'd like you to do that now in something that you're working on.